All right, so today we're going to be talking about built-in objects and collections. Well, it turns out we can make our own collections from scratch in VBA. We can even make our own objects from scratch. Remember, an object's a thing that we manipulate. It's got two important characteristics. What are the two characteristics of objects that we're really interested in? Methods, which is something the object knows how to do, and properties, which is something that it's like a variable built into the object. It's a value that tells me something about the way the object is configured. And so we can make our own objects from scratch. But today, we're focusing on just looking at some of the built-in objects and collections that are available to us in Excel. So we have a workbook to download. So let's go ahead and download that workbook. Anytime you are downloading a workbook from online that is an XLSM, you want to make sure that you really trust who you're downloading that from. You should trust me, but you want to make sure that you really trust, because VBA, like when you enable that macro, it literally has the ability to wipe out your entire, like all the storage on your computer. It could just wipe it out relatively quickly. It could do all kinds of other things. It can reach out and talk to web servers on your behalf. It could log your keystrokes. I think it can log your keystrokes in Excel and send them other places. So you want to be really careful about that. In fact, Microsoft, like in the late 1990s, this was like really dangerous. And now they've kind of got it mostly under control. And one of the things they've done to get it under control, I'm going to show you because this will be important. Every time you download, before you can open it, you're going to have to do something to it. So it's going to be tempting here just to click on, say, hey, I want to open that file. But before you open it, you want to open up the folder, show the folder location for it. And if you're one of my Mac users, I don't think you have to worry about this, but on a PC you do. So you're going to right-click that file and choose Properties. And you've got to unblock it. Any macro-enabled file that comes down from the web, they're saying, listen, if you can't figure out how to do what we just did, right-click, go to Properties, and unblock it, you're not qualified to run a macro, to open up a macro-enabled workbook that you have downloaded from the web. It's just no good is going to come of that. And so anytime you're downloading any of the examples from this class that are .xls, sometimes we'll start with a .xlsx. Those you don't have to worry about. But .xlsm, macro-enabled workbook, you've got to go and enable those. How many of you already knew you had to do that with macro-enabled files? About half, okay. So I'll unblock that. And then I should then be able to open it at that point. And it should open just fine. So apparently my privacy matters. I'm not sure why this shows up every time I start, but that's the way it is. Certainly. Good luck. Is it there? If you find the bread left over from sacrament on Sunday, it's probably still good. You could take that too.
Is it pre-blessed though?
It's probably not, because it was in the sealed bag. The blessing couldn't reach it. All right. Let's see, we're recording. I think I'm recording this screen. And so what do you think, looking at this worksheet, if you were to say, I'm going to identify something on that worksheet and say, yeah, I think that's an object. Just someone look at here and say, you know what, that's probably an object. Something on this sheet. Yeah, go ahead. The chart, yeah, chart is an object. Interestingly, a chart actually is held inside of a shape, which is a different kind of object. So when you look at a chart, there's actually two objects. We're going to play just a little bit with that today. But yeah, so that's what else? And looking at that screen, go ahead. Oh, so is a sheet an object? Yes. Is a cell an object? Yes. Yeah, so good. So we're trying to get the feeling for this. Now, some of the things that aren't objects, it turns out like the grid line between the cells, that's not an object. There's no methods or properties to that grid line that we can manipulate. But the range, it's got methods, like a range has methods and properties. A column has methods and properties. A row has methods and properties. The sheet does, the charts do. The whole workbook itself is an object. Even Excel, the application, is an object that has methods and properties that we can access and manipulate. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of poke around at some of these and just kind of see what we can do with them. So why don't we start off kind of working at the top level here, looking at multiple workbooks. So I'm going to bring up my code, Alt F11. We'll bring up that code window, or go to your developer tab and click on the Visual Basic Editor. And so even though this is a macro-enabled workbook, there's no module in it. So let's go ahead and insert a new module. So I'm just going to come to the tools or to the menu over here in Visual Basic, choose Insert and Module. And let's make a sub procedure. Sub, we'll call this workbooks. Workbook. Workbooks is probably a reserved word, so let's call it workbook demo. All right, so I'm going to start off here just by printing the some information about the workbooks collection. So there it is. Workbooks is a collection. Which workbooks do you think are in that collection? Do you think that's every workbook on your computer? Do you think it's every workbook you've ever made? What is it? It's every workbook, something, fill in the blank. Every workbook that is open. So your workbooks collection says, listen, any workbook that you have open, and actually that's not quite true. Every workbook that's open in this instance of Excel. Now you have to really do some special stuff to get two copies of Excel running simultaneously. So almost always you've only got one instance of Excel open. But it's possible to say, oh, I've got Excel running here and Excel running here. I've got workbooks over here. And if I access the workbooks collection from the code in that one, I've got the one that's just in that Excel. So it's the workbooks that are open in the current copy of Excel. And so all collections have a method, a property called count. And it will just tell you how many there are. Now, if I'm kind of look here, it looks like I have just one workbook open as I'm looking at my other screen that shows me my open applications. So let's go ahead and run this. I'm expecting this to print 1. Okay, excellent. Is there anyone here who has just one workbook open, and when they run that code, it prints 2? This happens pretty often. Anyone? The reason that you might get 2 showing when you only have one workbook open is because if you've ever recorded a macro and put it in your personal macro workbook, the first time you do that, it says, oh, we're going to create this personal macro workbook. And then every time you open Excel after that, it's going to open that workbook and hide it. So you may have another workbook hidden. And that would be your personal macro workbook. So even if you can't see it, and like you try to Alt Tab or you try to go find it, it's just not available because it's hidden. All right. So there's the count. So let me go ahead and do this. All collections have a way to be able to put new objects into the collection. So right now, there's one object in this collection. How do you think is a way that I could put another object into this collection? There's a couple ways I could do it. Yep. So I could actually make a brand new workbook. Workbooks.add. Let's give it a try. Name of the collection, workbooks.add. And that should just make a brand new workbook. So now I'll say workbooks.add, and I will run that, and it should open up a workbook, make a brand new workbook, and then it should report the count, and now the count should be 2. So there's 2, and it has opened up this other workbook here. If I run it again, it'll open up another workbook, there'll be 3, and so forth. Now, when I open up that workbook, it may very well be that I would like to be able to do something with that workbook. And when I open a new workbook, or when I create a new workbook, that is going to be the active workbook. And so here's another way that I can refer to a particular workbook is by this thing, active workbook. So we've got workbooks.add here. And now there's a kind of a special name to identify this particular object. So let me I'm going to do this on the same line. Debug.print workbooks.count and active workbook dot name. I'm just going to print the name of the active workbook. And so which workbook is active right now should be book 1. But when I run this code again, it's going to add a workbook that will become the active workbook. And so I'm expecting it to be book 2 that it prints. It'll just print book 2. So it should print 3 for the number of workbooks and then book 2. Go ahead and run it. And so it printed 3 for my number of books, and book 2 is the name of the workbook that's active. So when I open up, when I create a new workbook, or just when I open an existing workbook, we'll see how to do that here in just a moment, then that's going to be the active workbook. So that's nice. I could refer to it that way. But, what if I need to refer to it even after the user has activated some other workbook and maybe even named it, something that I don't even know the name they might have named it. I just made a new workbook. I'm gonna let the user save it, but I still wanna know which one it is. I won't be able to get to it by its name, which I could record right when I act. I could put that into a variable and go, oh, that's the name of this workbook. And then if it's no longer active, how else could I figure out that workbook? And because that's a common problem, Microsoft has made a solution to this. And that is when I create a new workbook, not only does it make a new workbook, but it's going to build that object, that workbook object is going to be put in memory. It's loaded into memory, has to be in memory. And it's going to send back the address in memory to where it created it. Remember, we've got all this memory. You know, the memory addresses are as long as your arm. 64 bits in this case. And so it's going to be located somewhere in memory. And that add workbook, that add method of the workbooks collection is going to send back the memory address where it's located. It's going to say, hey, I put this in memory somewhere, and in case you want to refer to it in memory, here's the address where it is. Fortunately, we don't have to think about it as the address. But what we're going to do is we're going to capture it in a variable that's meant to hold a memory address. And that's the object variable type. So let me come here before I say add, and I'm going to say dim WB as a workbook, as object. And now this is going to be, not only will this open the workbook, but it's going to send back a reference. It's going to send back the memory address to where that workbook was open. And so I'm going to say WB equals. But kind of the weird thing about working with object variables is that you don't just say they equal something, you have to use the keyword set. It's a long explanation for why you have to say set. And for now, I want you to say, I got it. If it's an object variable, I have to say set in front of it. By the way, if it's a normal variable, you don't have to say anything. Let me just do this real quick. Dim x as an integer. I could just say x equals 5, right? That's fine. But there's an analogous word to set called let. I could say let x equal 5. And it turns, what I like about that is that it turns that statement into a sentence. You know, it's almost like the voice of God. Let x equal 5, you know, and then all of a sudden x equals 5. So it's like a full statement here. But we got tired of typing let all the time. And so we said, you know, we wrote to Microsoft, please, can you make it so we don't have to type let in front of every variable? And they said, sure. So it's optional there. But if you're doing an object variable, the word you use is set. If you're doing a non-object variable, you use let, or you can skip it because it's optional. But that's kind of the parallel notation. Okay, so now the thing is that this variable is going to be like a handle to that workbook, a nickname to that workbook. So active workbook.name, I'm going to print that. And so here's one way to refer to that most recently opened workbook. But because I've captured a reference, right, it sends back its address and I capture it, I can also use that to refer to that same workbook. So I'm going to print, it's going to print the same thing twice. But when I run it again, it's going to say we've got now another workbook open, and now book 3 should be the active workbook, and I'll see it printed twice because it's going to say you got 4 workbooks open now, and the active workbook is book 3, and the workbook that I'm connected onto is also book 3. That would have been better if I'd had that on its own line, but it looked like that. Okay. This idea of using an object variable is, it's confusing. It's kind of an abstract thing to think about because you can't see this stuff happening in memory. And so just show me how comfortable you are with what we just did from 0 to 5. Seeing some 5s, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Well, if you're voting, you're 4 or 5. Okay. All right, well, we've got a few workbooks open now. Workbook name. Let's go ahead and close the one that we opened. So I'm going to, let's do this. I'm just going to put up a message box. I don't think we've seen this method yet, or this statement, MSG BOX. Message box just allows us to display a simple dialog box, an informational dialog box to the user. And I'm just going to say, we just created a workbook, WRK, named, and then I'm going to concatenate onto that WB.name. So it's still going to print it in the immediate window, but we should now also get it as a little dialog box that pops up here in Excel. So I'm going to run this. We're making a new sheet. We just created a workbook called Book 4. Okay, excellent. The whole point is I want this to pause long enough to be able to see the workbook, because the next thing I'd like to do is manipulate something on that workbook with that variable. So we just created a workbook, and now I want to do something to it. What am I going to do to that new workbook that we just created? Let me just kind of put some text onto it. I'll just put some text onto so say B2. So now I'm going to say, starting with that workbook, WB, that's going to refer to the workbook. Now I want to get to a particular worksheet in that workbook. Well, we've seen how to refer to a worksheet by name, and we know the sheet's going to be named 1. We'll see another way to do it here in just a minute. But I'm going to say WB.worksheets, or I think it records just as sheets. Or does it do worksheets? I don't remember now. Either way will work. You can say worksheets or sheets. And then in quotes, the name of the sheet. WB worksheets sheet 1 dot range on that sheet B2 dot value equals this book is currently named ampersand WB.name. And I'm going to put that before the message box so we can see it there. So we're going to open up a new book, and we can see it's written to that page, and we're able to see it and move on. Questions here? These lines can get kind of long, especially if we start referring to a different instance of Excel. So you can say a particular instance of Excel, in that instance of Excel, a particular workbook, in that workbook, a particular worksheet, in that worksheet, a particular cell, and then we're doing something with it. And we could be doing some complex properties, like I want to change the font, refer to the font object of that cell, and then refer to the bold property of that. It can be a long expression to get down to something. Okay. Now what I'd like to do is I would like to actually close that workbook. So reference to the workbook dot close. Now notice that when I type workbook.close, sometimes like when you type something, you get a little bit of help. MSGBOX dot, space, and it goes, oh, I recognize what you're talking about. You're going to want to do something, and I can help you with what has to come here next. This is called IntelliSense, and it's handy. But there's actually things I can put. There's like arguments to give to the close method, and it's not telling me anything about them. And that's because all I've told VBA here is that this is some kind of object. Just hold an address in memory, and I'll refer to what's ever in memory at that location, and I'll try to do something with it. And that works okay, but it turns out I can be more specific about the kind of object I'm going to be connecting onto with that variable. And so instead of calling it an object type, I'm going to call it workbook type. So I'm declaring now my WB variable as a data type called workbook. It is still an object variable. What I've done by saying this is going to be a workbook variable is it's still going to receive a memory address, and it's just going to hold that memory address and use that as a nickname for that worksheet over there in memory. But now I'm doing two things. One, I'm saying the only kind of object that I can connect this variable onto is the type workbook. If I try to bind this object onto a worksheet or to a cell or to a chart, it'll just say, no, you can't do that. So I'm limiting what I can do with it. But the real reason I do this is because once you do that, you're informing the interpreter or you're informing the editor what kind of object it is. And so now it can help us. So now when I type WB close and hit space, and just go ahead and type the E again on this and hit space, it goes, oh, this is a workbook object. I know what you can do when you say workbook object dot close. You have an argument here called save changes. And I'm going to set this to false. It's a true or false argument. I'm just going to say false. So I'm going to close it, and I'm not going to save the changes. So we're creating a workbook. We got too many workbooks created now anyway. So I'm going to create a workbook. I'm going to put some data in it. I'm going to close it without saving it. It's kind of a pointless exercise, but we're just getting familiar with these kinds of object collections. In fact, this reminds me of something that happened before I went back to school to get my doctorate. I did corporate training, traveled around the country, teaching information systems to companies. And let's see, where did this happen? I think I was teaching for Blue Cross of California, like in Glendale, California. And we had a student in class that was a kind of annoying student, regularly made annoying comments. Do you know the student I'm talking about? Oh, you're volunteering. It was me. Yeah, that was every single class I was ever in had a student like that because it was me. That was it. But anyway, we had just gone over how to record a macro, and I think I had said something like, here's how you can automatically save your workbook. You could have your code save the workbook without prompting the user. Like, it was close the workbook, save the changes, and not prompt the user, just save and close. And I forget the example that we were working on, but it was, something filling in that example. And he raised his hand, he sat in the back, he raised his hand and he said, how would you change that code so that it would close the workbook without prompting the user and discard the changes? And it wasn't what we were doing, but it was changing true to false. Oh, you just change this from true to false, and that's exactly what it would do. And about 3 minutes later, he goes, like you laugh out loud. And the class kind of looked towards him, and I said, what? And he said, I just made a macro that will, when you run it, it closes the workbook without saving the changes, without notifying the user. And I assigned the shortcut key to it of, you guys are with me on this, Control S, right? And we gave a laugh that wasn't as enthusiastic as you just gave. It was a little bit of a laugh. Okay, let's move on. Now, roll the clock forward a couple of hours. It's like an all-day class. And it was like, all right, let's break for lunch. Everyone save your work. And he goes, huh? What? And he'd forgotten. We're on a different workbook, but that workbook was still open. And so that Control S binding still went to that macro. And so all the work we had done, he went to save it and it dumped it off because he had that macro open. So anyway, then we had a really good, it was kind of a belly laugh at that time, and we broke and we went for lunch. That was good. Okay, so now we should see this happen. So we've got book 5 here. When we run it, we should see the name pop in as book 6. It will pause and then it'll close and go away. So let's go ahead and run it. Okay, good. We just created a book named book 6. We can see it. It's called book 6. It really is called book 6. And now when we click OK, so this dialog box has paused our code. And when we click OK here, it should continue running the code and it should close that workbook. And there it did. Closed it. There was a change to it. In fact, if we just come here and close this one, if we just close it, it's going to say, you probably want to save the changes. And we suppressed that through the code. We said, close it, don't save the changes. I know what I'm doing. All right. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is like a preview. We haven't really talked about loops yet. We got introduced to a loop when we recorded the macro. We've got a whole day where we're going to talk about the different kinds of loops. But let's go ahead and look at. I'm going to make another one here that just. I'm going to call it show open workbooks or info. There we go. I'll call it workbook info. Workbook info. And so I have this collection. I have this workbooks collection that has a reference to all of the workbooks that I have open right now. Now what I'd like to do is I would like to write a loop that will go across it. And I think we're going to stick with the same loop that we used before, even though it's going to be a little bit more. There's some simpler loops for doing this, but let's stick with the one that I've already exposed you to kind of reinforce that. Does anyone remember the name of the loop that we use to make our stock collecting macro run over and over and over again? What kind of loop was that? What was one of the key words used in that loop? Do. Yes, it's called the do loop. The word that starts the loop is called do, and the word that ends the loop is loop. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to put that structure in here. Do loop. Now, by the way, if I was to run this right now, it seems amazing, but like the Visual Basic Interpreter, okay, we got to tell a little bit more of the story of the Visual Basic Interpreter. The Visual Basic Interpreter has been in every single copy of Excel. Well, there are some Mac ones that didn't have it, but virtually every single copy of Excel since 1995. The Visual Basic Interpreter has been there. The vast majority of Excel users have no idea that it's there. Can you imagine that poor Visual Basic Interpreter? Every time Excel starts up, he wakes up and he goes, oh, okay, great. What am I going to do today? And what's the answer? Nothing. Thanks for waking up. I don't even know you exist, and so I'm not going to have you do anything. And then like Excel starts to close down and he goes, well, it wasn't today. Maybe next time. And so when you give it something to do, when you give that interpreter something to do, it is so excited to do it. It's like, yeah, whatever it is, I'm just so thrilled to have something to do. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it really hard. Now, if we look at this, what will this code do? This says the beginning of the loop. That says go where? Back to the beginning. You might look at that and think the interpreter is going to think this is a really boring thing to do. No. The interpreter is like, I am so excited to do this. I'm going to do this with all of my effort. I am going to show my user that I can do this really, really well. In fact, it's going to do it so well that it's going to completely take over the process that Excel is running in. So if you try to do anything else, it's going to be like, sorry, we're really busy running this loop that you asked us to do right now. And so, what would you have to do? Yeah, you could like take the battery out of your laptop. That would do it. That would stop it. Or you could like kill Excel. If you're on Mac, you would like go find the process number and kill the process number. If you're on Windows, here, I guess I'll go ahead and do it. I'm going to save this first. Let me go ahead and save this. I got to find the right, here's this workbook. I don't want to lose my code. So I'm saving this, and I am going to save it so I can post it as fall of 23. Okay, I'm going to run this loop. Okay, it's running, and I can do nothing over here in Excel. Any one of these Excels, forget it. I want to go back to my code, and I want to come up here and stop the code. Can't do it. Why? Because that loop is really, really running. Do Control-Shift-Escape to get to my, oh, I may not be able to get to the task man. Oh, shoot. Control-Shift-Escape should open the task manager, and that is not available. Control-Alt-Delete. You can't see it, but I get sign out and cancel are my only options. I think I'm going to have to reboot the machine. That's terrible. Okay, I'm going to try to right-click the icon and see if it gives me the ability to close. Close all windows. Will that do it? Okay. So listen, do you want to restart the program or wait till this? I don't want to wait for it to respond because that's going to take too long. So boom, Excel is gone. We're opening it back up. Our privacy matters. Thank you. And it only recovered one of my workbooks. That's kind of surprising. Okay, so let me come back to my code. Enable macros, Alt F11. So the point is, whenever I make a do loop, even if I give it a way to get out, it is really easy to accidentally put myself into an endless loop. And so anytime I have a do loop, I'm going to put in here do events. Do events is a little statement to the interpreter that says, I just might want to get your attention. So I know I've finally given you something to do. After years of neglect, I have given you something to do, but I might want to get your attention. And so by putting that do events in there, what do events does, it tells the interpreter, I'm going to take a little break right here, and I'm just going to put my head up and see if there's something else that's trying to happen at this moment. Is the screen trying to update? Is my user trying to interrupt this code, which is the main thing we're after here? And it will say, I will yield for just a moment to see if someone's trying to do something else. And if so, we'll let it happen. Otherwise, I'm going to get back to running this loop. So now, if I run that same loop with the do events in it, I'm locked up again. I think. Is it running? It's running. But now I can actually select the cell because for each cycle, it's saying anything you want to do, anything you're trying to do. Oh, you're trying to select a cell? Okay, we'll let you select a cell. Oh, you're trying to stop me by hitting the pause button? Okay, I'll let you pause me. And so, like anytime, in fact, when you're first starting, I would say anytime you're making a loop at all, put do events in it. And for sure, like for me, listen, I have been coding in VBA since 1995. I mean, I've been doing this since the very beginning. And I still will accidentally put myself into an endless loop from time to time. And so whenever I write a do loop, it's just habit to say, put do events right in it, because it will help you save your code. All right. Now what I'm going to do here, let me stop my code. And by the way, there's also a keystroke that will let you break in your code. It's control break, but you may not have a break on your laptop keyboard, but control break will also break into it. I'm going to comment out my close because I did want a few more workbooks open. So I'm just going to run my other demo to get a few workbooks open. Yeah, we got number 1 open. Yeah, we got a couple more open. For this next example, I want to have a few workbooks. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and still declare workbook, WB as workbook. Well, let me do this first. Dim x as integer. So just a number. And what I want to do is I want to print off the names of all of the workbooks that are currently open. And so I'm going to do until X is greater than the number of workbooks that are open. How do I find out how many workbooks are open? There's a property of my workbooks collection that tells me that. What's the name of that property? Workbooks.count. Do until X is greater than workbooks.count. Now, if I'm relying on X going larger than workbooks.count, let me start off by setting it to its first legal value, set it to 1, because collections start counting at 1. If you are coming from other programming environments, you might be used to similar constructs starting to count at 0. But in VBA, collections start counting with 1. So the first element in the collection is number 1. Do until X is greater than number of workbooks. We're going to start it there. And I better do something inside this loop to make X go larger. X is going to equal its current value plus 1. In fact, I'm just to make sure that I read that as a statement instead of some kind of bizarre equality where X is equal to X plus 1. So let X take on a new value. What's the new value going to be? It's going to be 1 larger than its old value was. And then here, I'm just going to debug.print workbooks collection. And then in parentheses, I'll tell it which one I want. Now, I'm going to do this. Let me just do this up here in the immediate window so we can kind of see it in a less abstract form. So I'm going to print, by the way, question mark in the immediate window is shortcut for debug.print. So you don't, I think every time I've done it so far, I've typed in debug.print up here, but the question mark does the same thing. So my workbooks collection, number 1. And that is going to refer to one of the workbooks. Which workbook do you think that's going to refer to? The first one that was opened. And so it's giving me the name of that one that was open. The next one will be not the next one that was opened, but the next one that was opened and is still open. And apparently that one's called book 5, version 1. That's the one that was auto-saved. What's number 3? Should be the one that I just opened. It probably doesn't have a name after it. Yeah, it's just called book 1. By the way, have you seen this extension before, XLSB? XLSB stands for Excel binary format. So it can do macros the way an XLSM can, but it's a proprietary format. So it's like a little bit more efficient than XLSM. But anyway, that's what it is. So it's also a macro-enabled workbook. Okay. But the point is that I could plug in that variable X because the first time through here, debug.print, so you don't need the question mark. That's going to print book number 3 for however many workbooks we have open. But now I'm going to change that for X. So the first time through this, X is going to equal 1. Is X larger than the number of workbooks I have open? No. So that's not going to, I'm going to stay in this loop. I'm going to print the name of workbook number 1. I'm going to change X to 2, hit loop, takes me back to the top of the loop. Is 2 larger than the number of workbooks I have open? If so, I'm out. If not, I come in here and print number 2's name and so forth. So that should print off the names of all of my workbooks. So it should start with the air traffic example, do book 5, and then book 1, 2, and 3, I think. Let's run it. So I've got a loop now that allows me to, like, say I want to look at all my workbooks, and now I can start looking at the properties of that workbook. Like maybe there's a workbook that I need to find. There's some characteristic. I don't know what the name of the workbook is, but I know the value that's going to be in cell B2 of sheet 1. And when I find it, I can go, aha, that's the one I'm after. In fact, why don't we just go ahead and do that? It's kind of an interesting example. Let me do this. I'm going to say dim WB as a workbook. And I'm looking for the workbook that says this book is currently named book 3. So I'm looking for You know, I'm saying I want to find out of all the work, I want to look across all the workbooks and find the one that has that in range B2 of sheet 1. So now I'm just going to put something else I haven't shown you yet. We've got a whole day talking about the if statement. Let me just introduce it to you really quickly, not in all of its glory, but just in its simplest form. If, then, and if. Between the if and the then, I'm going to put some condition that will evaluate to either true or false. And what am I going to put here? I'm going to say workbooks sub x dot sheets. This is going to be a little bit of a problem because if I have a workbook, if I try to refer to this by a sheet's name, like sheet 1, what's the problem? What's going to be the problem with this? I'll finish this off and then we'll ask what the problem is. Dot range B2 if the value of that cell is equal to this book is currently book 3, then I want to do something. Go a little bit wider here. So between the if and the then is something that's going to evaluate to true or false. But what is going to be the problem when I run this code? Or what is potentially the problem, especially when we look at this sheet? Go ahead. There's no sheet 1. There's no sheet named sheet 1. And so when I'm looking at this sheet, I'm going to say, refer to sheet 1 in this workbook. And what's the interpreter going to do? Sorry, I'm not even, no. There's no sheet. You're telling me to refer to a sheet that doesn't exist. I don't know what to do. He's willing, but not that capable. Like you would think that maybe he'd figure it out, but he doesn't. Maybe he is a she. I don't know the gender of the interpreter, the VBA interpreter. So how else could we refer to that sheet? Any thoughts? Kind of based on what we extend what we've seen about a workbook to the workbook collection to the collection of worksheets. Yep. Oh, we could reference the active sheet. Oh, I like it. I like it. Only problem is, I don't know if the sheet that I'm looking for is going to be active. But I have the same problem if I do what I was going to do, and that is just look at the first sheet. So we could just look at the active sheet. Let's just go ahead and do that. It's a good suggestion. Let's give it a shot. So I'm just going to look at the active sheet, and I think even though in all of Excel there's only one active cell, I think each workbook has an active sheet. I'm going to just kind of test that out to find out. So let me say workbooks, workbook number 2 dot active sheet dot name. And I want to put a question mark, workbooks active sheet dot name. Yeah, sheet 1. So even though it's not the active workbook, there's a sheet on it that's active. So instead of looking at sheet 1, I'm just going to plug in active sheet here. And so if I find a workbook with the active sheet, with B2 on the active sheet that has that text in it, I'm going to run whatever in here. If this evaluates to true, between the if and then evaluates to true, then we run whatever code is between the if and the end if. If it's false, we drop to the end if and skip over whatever code may be there. Found the workbook. Oops, debug.print. Found the workbook. And then I'm just going to put the workbook's name, which should be workbook sub x dot name. So I don't know the name of the workbook, but I know I'm looking for something on the active sheet. And once I find it, it should print that. If I find it, it should print that. I'll run it and find out. Whew. So we're printing all the names. I think I'm going to comment out the line that says we're printing that name. And we'll run it. It says it found the book. Oh, I need to do the dot name on this. By the way, when you get to a yellow line here, like you have some error in your code and you run it, it's like, oh, here's the line that we tried to run and there was an error. At this point, I can actually fix that line and tell it to continue running. So I put the .name on there, and like most students are like, okay, I better run this again. You don't have to. You don't have to hit stop. You can just keep going from there, and it will just pick up where it left off with the new code that you wrote and move along. It's really like what you can do with debugging in VBA is really neat, even though it's pretty old. Okay, questions here? Let's do one more thing on this example, and that is when we find it, instead of printing it out, let's just bind our workbook variable onto it. Let's set WB equal to that workbook, not the workbook's name, but to the workbook itself. And then let's get out of this. I guess that's fine. We'll learn how to exit a loop prematurely later, but it's only going to find this once for us. And then what I'd like to do is say at the end of this loop, WB dot close false. Okay, so let me go ahead and make sure that we can see that particular workbook. This is the one here. Named book 3. That's the one that we're looking for. I'll make it so it's not the active workbook. So now, when I run this, I'm going to give you another little preview for something we're going to spend a lot more time on. Instead of just putting the play button, I'm going to come here and I'm going to hit debug and I'm going to say step into, or I could just do it by pressing F8, but I'll choose step into. The idea behind stepping through code is to say, don't just run the code, but I want to go one line at a time. So show me the line that you're about to execute. It's right on the very beginning of the sub-procedure. And that yellow line says we haven't run it yet, but now we're ready to. So I can execute that one by doing debug, and I'll do that same thing again. Step into, step over, and step out are all really similar. We'll talk about the differences later. For right now, we're just going to do the first one, step into, or F8 on the keyboard. And it doesn't, by the way, the memory declaration lines, it actually processes those before it starts running the procedure. So you never actually hit those lines when you're stepping. I'm just going to use F8 to go through this. It's going to come in here. It wasn't that one, didn't set WB to it. So we're moving along back up to the top of the loop. Didn't find it there. Here's the third one. I think it's going to find it here. No. Here's the next one. I think it's going to find it here. No. How many do I have open? Ah, there it is. So it found that one. I'm going to keep going. So now WB has been set. I get to the loop, back up to the top. Is X larger than my workbook count? Yes. So let me out of the loop. And now it's going to close that workbook. So I kind of looked through all my open workbooks. I connected my variable up to the one that I wanted. And now I'm ready to kind of continue working with it. So I might have lots of other stuff that I want to do with that workbook. In this case, I'm just closing it. But now I've hooked up that variable to that particular workbook and I'm ready to process it. So when I run this line, we should see this worksheet just close. That workbook close. And it finishes off the sub procedure. Comfort level on what we just did, 0 to 5. 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Okay, 4. All right. We got about 20 minutes. I do want to look both at sheets and at these chart objects as well. So let's go ahead and do a worksheet demo. Sub worksheet demo. I'm going to dim WS as a worksheet this time. Object variable, but instead of hooking up to a workbook, I'm going to hook it up to a worksheet. And we're going to do something really similar. So dim X as an integer. Do until. And I'm going to do another, here's another new thing. This workbook. Dot. So we've seen several ways to refer to a workbook. we can refer to a workbook in the workbooks collection by its name. Like in quotes, we can put the name of the workbook. Did we see that? Maybe we didn't see that. Anytime you've got a collection, those collections have names, you can almost always refer to items in that collection by name. So let me just come here and quickly do print workbooks. Collection of workbooks, right? I can do like the second workbook and ask for its name. I could do the third workbook and ask for its name. I think it's going to be book 1. But I can also, of course, look at other things, like how many sheets does it have? One sheet. But the point is, if the items in my collection are named, I can almost always refer to them by their name. And that's book 1. And you'll see that still gets a valid reference to that workbook. So I can refer to objects in a collection by their ordinal position in the collection by using a number. If they're named objects, I refer to it by its name. We've seen 2 other ways to refer to a particular workbook. We've seen an object called active workbook, so whichever workbook is currently active, it's referring to that workbook. And now we're seeing this one, which is this workbook. This workbook, workbook, W-O-R-K book, refers to the workbook that contains the code that is currently running. And so which workbook does this workbook refer to in the context that I have here? Like I've got my old book 5, I've got book 1 and 2, I think I've closed book 3. I've got my air traffic book. Which one is this workbook? That's the air traffic. That's the one I'm writing the code in. So this code is in some workbook. Which workbook is it in? It's in this workbook. And so it's really handy because often you're saying, I want to refer to the workbook that's identified by the code that's running, the one that's holding the code. So I'm going to do until, just one until is enough. This workbook until X is greater than this workbook dot worksheets dot count. I'm going to set X equal to 1 to start because it's a collection, so it's 1 based. I'm going to put do events in here. I'm going to increment X. And I'm going to print the name of the worksheet. Print this workbook, worksheets sub X dot name. So I've got several workbooks open. I'm ignoring all those workbooks except for my air traffic workbook. And I think I've got 2 sheets in this workbook. Air traffic and charts. So I'm going to go ahead and run that, and it should put up air traffic and charts onto this sheet. So we're looping through that. Probably should have done F8 to go through it so we can see it. X is 1. Worksheets.count is 2. So it's X is not 1 is not bigger than 2. It's going to print off that name. Increment X. Now X is 2. 2 is not greater than 2, so that expression is false. So we stay in here. It'll print off that one. And now X is 3, and it lets me out. Okay. So again, the structure of this is identical to when I was going through all the workbooks in my collection. I'm just using a different collection. I'm looking at the worksheets instead of the workbooks. Questions here? So again, similarly here, I could say, hey, when I find the worksheet I'm after, I could do something on that worksheet. So another similar approach. What else do we want to do with a worksheet? Let's go ahead and add a worksheet. this workbook. Oh, by the way, if I don't say this workbook, this works just like this, like just worksheets.count. If I refer to the worksheets collection without specifying which workbook I'm talking about, which one do you think it's going to choose? The active workbook, yeah. And so this is the place that kind of beginning VBA users often get into trouble, because they'll write their code, and when they're writing their code, they only have their workbook that has the code open in it. And so when you go to run it, that's where it works. But then they go to give it to someone else to work, and they've got 3 or 4 workbooks open. They open up this and they try to do something, and it works just fine until they activate another workbook and then run it. Because if you don't specify which workbook you're talking about, it's going to assume the active workbook. And so it's always a good idea. If you're talking about the workbook that has the code, it's always a good idea to identify it as this workbook in your code. All right. I'm just going to go ahead and add at the end of this loop. I'm going to go ahead and add a worksheet. Word sheets.add. So now if I run that, should run through, and we'll see it's put a new worksheet onto that workbook. And similarly, I can bind the object variable onto this. Set work ws equal to the result from that add. And now I can say ws.name equals sheet ampersand now. Now returns the time, the date and time from the system clock. I don't think there's any illegal characters in that for a sheet name. If there is, we're about to find out. So that should, it doesn't like it. So what doesn't it like? No slashes. I picked up the slashes from the name. So instead of now, let me just put in seconds. The second of now. That should just pull it's the second part off of that. So whatever seconds are, so sheet 8, apparently it was 8 seconds on the system clock. If I run it again, it'll be a little higher, 13 seconds on the system clock. Run it again, go a little higher, 17 seconds on the system clock. I wanted to put something there because if I just put a constant, I'd only run once and then it would die. Now at least I've got a fighting chance of having it be a legal sheet name. Okay, and then of course I could delete the sheet with ws.delete. Oh, here's something. This is probably worth looking at. Let's go ahead and do that one. ws.delete. I named it, and now I'm going to delete it. That seems kind of pointless. But let's look at what happens when I run it this time. Whenever you delete a sheet, Excel goes, whoa, slow down there, cowboy. You're deleting a whole sheet. That could be a lot of data on there. Are you sure you want to do this? How annoying that when I delete it through code, it still wants me to approve it. Yuck. Shall we see how to suppress that message? Let's see how to suppress that message. Suppressing that message is actually a method, delete, sure, is a method of the Excel object itself. And so before I get to that delete statement, I'm just going to say, refer to the whole object of Excel, and that is application. An application has a method, has a property called display alerts. And I can set that equal to false. And so what I've said is, I'm saying don't display alerts. And so now when I run this, it'll add the sheet, it'll change its name, and as long as it doesn't have a collision with a name that already exists. And I'll just run that. Okay, so it added it, deleted it, just fine. Now, you might think, whoa, you just turned off display alerts. So what happens if I come out here and try to delete sheet 17? Is it going to do it without alerting me? And the answer is no. That display alerts only has to do with operations that happen through code. So I can, if I delete out here by hand, it'll still delete, it'll behave as normal. All right, one more example, we'll call it good. Oh, we may be at the end of class anyway by then. Let's do the chart demo. I think, let's see. In fact, let's do it. Instead of calling the chart demo, let's call it the shape demo. When you have a chart on its own sheet, the chart is just right there as the worksheet, is the chart itself. But when you put a chart onto a sheet, like you've still got all of your data and you've got a chart on there, then it's going to be in a shape. So let's go ahead and declare a couple of variables here. I'm going to dim SHP as a shape, the shape collection. Dim X as an integer. I'm going to set X equal to 1. I'm doing the same process that we've done already. Probably should copy and paste, but I'll type it out. Do until X is greater than, and I'm going to use the very first sheet in my workbook. It's called Air Traffic Passenger Statistics. And if I'm just going to look up here, yeah, so do until X is greater than this workbook dot worksheets sub 1 dot worksheets dot shapes. That'll be all the shapes on that sheet, and that's a collection as well. Dot count until X is greater than the count of the shapes on the worksheet. Loop. Do events. X equals X plus 1. Debug.print. It is so much effort to like get all the way here. I think I'm just going to like inside this, I'm going to set shape equal to that. SHP equals that particular shape. The X shape in that collection. And now I can refer to it by that, SHP. Shapes always have names. They're usually really bad names. But that should print off. I'll also print X as well. So I should see how many shapes there are on that sheet and what the names of those are. Variable not defined, degug. And, oh, the shapes are on charts. So to make my code work, I'm just going to drag my charts over here to be the first one. By moving that chart sheet over to the first position, that's now going to be sheet number 1. So we should be getting access to these charts. There's 9 charts there or so. So there's all 9 of them. Why are they called chart 4? Why do they start numbering at 4? It means like while I was making this example data, I made 3 charts ahead of it and threw them away. Made a chart, that's no good. Made a chart, that's no good. Finally, when I got to chart 4, that's what I'm after, and I made the rest of the charts. So that's just the name. You know, we could also delete those charts off. Ooh, deleting the charts off might be a little bit of a problem. Because when I delete the charts, all of a sudden my collection is going to get smaller. So let's not delete the charts. Instead, we'll just see that we can iterate through the charts, bind object variables onto them, do things that we might want to do with them as well. You can add a new chart into it and so forth. So here's the message from today. There are a lot of objects that are kind of built into Excel. The ones we've played with today, workbooks, worksheets, and shapes. They have properties that are common. All collections have a count property. Most collections have an add property too, that you can add something into it. And then you can bind on an object variable to individual members of those collections to be able to make manipulating a particular one easier. And I guess that's the message. That's the message. It's like a common thing to say, I got to look across all my worksheets and do something. I got to look across all the workbooks. I got to change the title on all of these charts. Make a loop that goes across them all and changes the title. And so that's working with built-in collections. Questions? It's like 2 minutes early. It's uncharacteristic. but we're going to be done 2 minutes early. Have a good Wednesday, and I will see you next week. Class dismissed.